Hello, everyone. Welcome to On the Settee. I hope you're all doing very well. So I want to welcome you not only to the Settee, but also into the front room, which is the beginnings of an ambitious long-term neighbourhood platform in Birmingham to be designed, co-owned and grown by local communities. For those who might be joining us for the first time, hello, welcome. I'd like to give you a little bit of insight into what On the Settee is and what that means in the front room. So in the front room, the Settee offers a place of sanctuary, a place where you can take a load off. And on our Settee, you will kind of experience stories that are like catching up with an old friend or your favourite song. Something that makes you feel at home, open, yet vulnerable with yourself and others. So on this season of On the Settee, we are programming a range of folks from Birmingham and beyond who are in the reading, writing and book selling community. And, you know, we're kind of looking at what that means around kind of access to ideas, to experiences, and what stories can be found at the heart of exploring yourself and the world around you. Who is writing these stories, whose experiences are being heard, what voices are being excluded or included, and how are books being accessed in the city. So I'm your host, Danny Banks Ingram, also known as Zaz, also known as Zazu. And today I'll be speaking to Shantel Edwards, who is the director of Birmingham Literature Festival. And just to let everybody know, the Q&A is open for this talk, so please feel free to drop your questions, whether you're with us today in Zoom or you're watching via YouTube. We kind of will get all those questions together. And yeah, feel free to just kind of add in a little comment as they kind of come to your mind. So firstly, Shantel, hello. Can you give us a little wave and maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. Saz, that might be the most excited anyone's ever been to say my name before, so thank you for that.
I like to jazz it up.
It was very jazzy. I felt very welcome. So yeah, I'm Shantel. I'm the director of the Birmingham Literature Festival. I started in the role at the beginning of, well, the very end of 2019. So I've had a kind of strange tenure as director so far, and a very unusual first year. I'm a Birmingham native. I am speaking to you from Erdington right now, North Birmingham, representing. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good potted history.
Okay, cool. I'm so excited to have you here, Shantel. I'm really excited for us to just kind of dig deep into a little bit of your work and what that kind of means in Birmingham and further afield, but also, you know, what it means kind of to be running a festival that is now happening in a pandemic and what that even looks like. So my first question is more about kind of the wider literature community. So what kind of behaviours do you think within that community need to change or be amplified or rewarded when it comes to more inclusive voices? And what does inclusive voices mean to you as well?
I think that's a really good question. And I've been thinking about that this week because I went to a conference on Monday called Rethinking Diversity in Publishing. And it was sort of based around a report that came out probably around this time last year by a couple of researchers at Goldsmiths. And periodically, I think the publishing industry or academics do work like this, where they talk to publishers and booksellers and they think about those questions of what needs to happen to make literature as a whole sort of more inclusive. And that report is really interesting. I mean, it's accessible online, so anyone can read it. It's free. But it talks about how, when we think of diversity or inclusivity, we tend to think about the types of books that we're reading, you know, having more authors of colour represented or more LGBTQ writers, that sort of thing. But actually that report says that it's obviously much more a much more systemic thing that needs to happen. So we need to sort of rethink about, you know, the staff at publishing houses. We need to think about the sales people who are the ones in charge of selling books to supermarkets and to bookstores. You know, we need to sort of rethink about how we're talking about literature, what media platforms and what publications we're talking to about books, because then that's going to affect who your audience is and who you're talking to. And it sort of says that really the publishing industry itself needs to rethink who its audience is, because I think there tends to be an assumption that there's a certain type of person that buys a book and they talk specifically to that type of person, and that just isn't the case. That's just not the case. But until all of those things change, which is obviously a big massive project. So I think it's a sort of big rethink that is involved for everybody that's involved in sort of every aspect of publishing and book selling and putting on events like festivals and things like that, to really think about, you know, who we're talking to, how we're broadening access, who we're asking to come and talk on panels. It's a big, that was a very rambly answer to your question, but I think it's a big question, and I think it's a big task to sort of think about that. And it's about time that, you know, everybody got involved in doing that, I think.
Absolutely, it's huge. I think there's like there's no like one size fits all answer to solve or to like totally understand all the nuance that is happening. And I think actually, like, just picking up on something you said, that like systemic element of it like almost broadens out the ways that we view what like inclusive means as well, because I think we can have quite quite broad ideas of it, and actually I think the magic kind of happens when those ideas get really narrow, right, sometimes, because it's like the smaller like little details, like looking at something under like a magnifying glass, which is also really hard because you then look and you're like, oh, there's so much, there's so many things, which is and always like an interesting place to kind of be at. So bearing all that kind of in mind, I'm quite interested in what some of that means kind of for the festival, and specifically like in Birmingham. So just more kind of about that like locality, like what do you think the actual experiences has actually been of audiences, like, or obviously who have come like further afield, that what does that kind of mean for us, I guess? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I guess it's one that I don't know in terms of the festival that I'm entirely qualified to answer, because obviously my first year of the festival and audiences for the festival is very different to you know, anyone who did the job previously or anyone else who works at Writing West Midlands and has worked on the various iterations of the festival across the years. Because I can only really speak to my experience of having delivered the festival online in a pandemic. But I think in terms of, I guess, what that means for the festival and thinking about the festival, one of the big things that we thought a lot about last year, and I guess we'll continue to think a lot about moving forward, is access. It is about, you know, in part how we make our events accessible in terms of like practically. So obviously with everything we did last year, we did podcasts and we did videos, we did online workshops, and we could make sure, you know, very practically that those things were accessible. You know, all the podcasts had transcripts, all the videos had captions. So, you know, from a practical perspective, thinking about access, but also I think, you know, moving forward, when we eventually can go back to real space events, which will be hopefully very soon, thinking about, you know, the spaces in which we put events on and what that means in terms of access. Because, you know, I grew up in Birmingham, I grew up in Erdington, in a working class family, and, you know, for us, we wouldn't have come into the city centre. That just wouldn't have been a place that we would have gone. You know, my parents wouldn't have taken, you know, me necessarily to the museum. And that's not to say anything about them. You know, I spent a lot of time in our local library, and they did a lot of like good things to sort of foster a love of like art and literature. But, you know, we wouldn't necessarily have come to the Rep, or, you know, come to a sort of a space like that. So I guess I'm really keen moving forward to think about access from like both perspectives, you know, how we make sure that everybody can come to an event if they want to come to an event, but also thinking about the spaces that we put those events on and how accessible those spaces might feel for someone who was, you know, grew up like I did, or grew up in an area like I did, sort of thing. So I think last year was a really good, it gave us the opportunity, like a really good opportunity to think about those things, and to really, you know, incorporate that into what we were doing. And I think I'm just really keen that we continue doing that going forward once things change again, because they will change again, I'm sure.
Absolutely. I think I really love the point that you made about kind of like, it's almost bringing the festival to people, not the people like, or feeling that they have to like go and this like experience something that like actually might be quite normal to them if it was happening in their local library, right? And I love that idea, and I think I understand that like personally as well. Like if something, when I was younger, if there was something happening, like I don't know if it was like you know, like a book fair, like the week where there's book fairs like in school, if on the weekend I was then going to the library, there'd be a different connection with this library that I literally would go to like every other week, which is like Smethwick Library, like shout out Smethwick High Street all day, every day. You know, but it would be different to what I was doing at school. I think there was like so much more of a kind of like, it felt less like, oh, I'm learning to read in this particular way. It was more like, oh, the library is like this, you know, place of like experience and like exploring, and I always felt like I connected more with those things, and these like book fairs or just things that are like happening in like the booking community, the writing and reading and literature community. There was something that was different, experiencing that in a place that I just knew really well, and this, I guess the idea of like accessibility again is like so vast, right? But I think at the same time, even through the pandemic, I think it's really taught us to do things in a different way, and that there are ways to do that. So yeah, I guess like what has, you know, doing the festival in the pandemic meant, like what have you learned now that the medium is different? What has that like looked like for you, and how do you feel about it as well?
Yeah, it has been a really good experience. It has, like, it's had its challenges, like everybody's year has. You know, there was a lot of new tech to learn. I don't know about anyone else, but if I never have to look at my own face on a Zoom screen again, I'll be happy. I'll be very happy with that. So it's had its challenges in terms of like getting up to speed with, you know, the way we deliver things differently. And because we did various different things. We did like videos, and we did podcasts, and we did stuff. We did like Zoom workshops. So everything's a slightly different way of doing things than the other thing. So that's been a sort of a learning curve, but I think a really good one. And like, I do feel much more equipped and much more tech savvy now than I did this time last year. And I think what's been interesting has been watching over the past year as other festivals and other publishers and, you know, other organisations, arts organisations have also flipped to doing their things online. So it can be sometimes a challenge, I guess, maybe to sort of differentiate what you're offering from what, you know, other publishers or other organisations are also offering. But I think the literature festival, our literature festivals, got a really good history of offering events that you wouldn't necessarily go to another festival and see. So it was just trying to distill that into an online form, which I think we did well. I'm very happy with what we did. And I think, you know, ultimately, one of the great things that happened last year is, you know, we've gone from being a regional festival that had, you know, a broad audience, but, you know, still mainly an audience from the surrounding regions, to being a festival that, you know, we've got listeners in the US now and Germany and like, you know, we're like international now in a way that we weren't international before. And the great thing we did, you know, the sort of the bulk of our program last year was a podcast series, and that meant that was all free. The majority of the content that we put out last year for the festival, with the exception of the writing workshops that we did, was free content, which again, like, just took us that, you know, that barrier to access is also gone now. It meant, you know, anybody could listen to them from anywhere. So that's been really nice. And, you know, from I guess this is my favorite thing that happened last year, is my dad started listening to the podcast. So which I love. So my dad, you know, isn't a reader, has never been a reader, like outside of when he read to us when like we were younger before bed, has just not a reader. There's no books in my parents' house that aren't like our books from when we were younger. You know, he reads the paper, but it's not, reading's never really been for him. And we did, because we'd done the podcasts, and I was like, oh, Dad, well, why don't you listen to these podcasts? And he did. And like, obviously he's biased because, you know, he is my dad. I am taking that bias into account. But he did, and he listened every week, and he was like, oh, you know, Shan, I'd really like to read this book. So for his birthday was in November, and we got him an Audible subscription, because I was like, okay, well, you don't want to read them in person, you haven't got time to sit down, like just try listening to one of them. And like, so that was November, and what we're in the beginning of May now, and he's listened to like 10 books, like most of which he'd like listened to the authors on the podcast. And you know, he's got a definite type of fiction that he likes to read, but like that to me was, I guess, just like my favorite thing, and like, so I guess really epitomized to me like the importance of delivering things like that in a different way than we'd done before, because my dad wouldn't have gone to a literature event, you know, he wouldn't have picked up a book. But because we put the podcast out there, he listened to the podcast, and then that meant that he'd gone and he's now listened to like 10 books. So we have conversations about books now, which is just amazing, and wonderful.
That has like warmed my heart. I'm literally like having like tingles, like, oh my gosh, like what a like amazing stories have happened, like. And there's something about this way of like what is your, as you said, but like what is your way in? The way in now, I think, even throughout the pandemic, has actually opened us up to be more kind of like imaginative and open to new possibilities, because before we wouldn't like have necessarily had to do that. Do you know what I mean? And I don't even think it's always to do with the lack of imagination, like not at all, but it's just like, why would we, if we like have been to festivals in this particular way, and you kind of know like the format and you know what you're getting ultimately. So that's just like so cool. Like your dad just like listening to the podcast and being like, oh, that book actually sounds really good. I'm gonna listen to the book. Like, you know, there's something really great about that. And what I find interesting is there are some books that like I wouldn't like read, because I'd like get to a part that is probably like a bit too, I'm like, oh, this is, I'm looking into the mirror here, and I'd be like, close, bye-bye, like, because I know what's coming. But if I listen to the book, I'm just like, oh, okay. Oh, right. There's no time for me to be like, I'm gonna Like I wouldn't pause this thing because I don't know it's coming, like because I'm not looking at the page. I'm just like, oh, that actually really, oh, okay, let's work through that. Let's like massage that muscle out, you know? And I think this like rise of like people listening to books, I think it's really, really like beautiful, because there's also something about the challenges that people can like have around like reading, when it comes to like your reading speed, and like how many books like someone else might be reading in a month, and you're like, oh, I'm still slogging through like this one book. And I think it takes some of that away, because you just like enjoying like words in a way that like we haven't always like grown up to that being normal in that way.
I think it fits in your life differently as well, doesn't it? Like, you know, I'm also a fan of audiobooks, and I listen to them while I'm walking the dog, or I've been listening to the same audiobook for a year because it's 45 hours long. And honestly, it's just this ongoing thing. And my partner's always like, it feels like this woman lives in our house now. Because when I first started, it's Duck's Newburyport, it's called, by Lucy Ellman, and it's like 1,000 pages, and it's stream of consciousness. And I picked it up, and like I thought I'm going to start reading this, and honestly I got a page in and I was just like, no, there's no full stop, no, I can't read this book. And then I saw it had come out as an audiobook, and I thought, oh, I'll give it a go. And it's completely different, because this woman's like acting it out, and it feels like, yeah, it does feel sort of like I spent a lot of the pandemic working from home by myself, because my partner's a teacher, so he's still been going into school, whereas I've just been at home with the dog. And honestly, it has felt a little bit like having a friend in the house, because it's the same woman's voice every day that I listen to while I'm doing the washing up. So I do think it you know, audiobooks they do work differently. And I think it does mean that, you know, if your life is really busy and you don't ordinarily, you know, you can't sit down on the sofa, and sometimes if I sit down on the sofa and I start to read, within like 2 minutes I'm asleep. This happens, you know, life's busy, right? But audiobooks, you can do them. And that was part of the reason that we decided on podcasts as well, because podcasts again just felt like, you know, they're things that you can listen to as you're doing something else, and it just makes the something else you're doing much more enjoyable.
Absolutely. And it's even like the intro, like of every time that I do, like for On the Settee, like the whole like premise behind it as well is that it's something that it's like a familiarity, but also I say to people, I'm like, you know, you can just like have it on in the background and like be doing your washing up, or like it fits into like your Sunday in a certain type of way. And that's something that I was really thinking like loads about. And it is this kind of like podcast kind of connection with like how stories kind of come through in different ways, and you feel differently about them. And like you said, like if you're listening to someone reading this book and acting this thing, it's almost like allowing your brain to just like absorb the story as well. And like that in itself is like different to like hearing your own voice reading a thing sometimes. And if I saw a book that was like 1,000 pages long, I know what happened. I'd start reading it, but I'd be really conscious, like, oh, what page number am I on? Not near the end. We're not there yet. Like, just chill. But there's that kind of like idea of like podcasts, and I'm really excited to see more of that. Like I hope that the things that we've like learned through the pandemic, like through art, through creativity, that we like hold on to some of that. Like I really just like hope that like there's like parts of festivals that are just a podcast, or like there's some of it that's like recorded in like a certain way that's like really accessible. And I just like that's like my like hopes and dreams kind of like for the future, I guess. I really hope that. But this leads me on to another question. What were and what are, I guess, your dreams around like literature and story? Because as much as this is about like, you know, the festival, it's also like really about you. And I want to know kind of like, who are you, Shantel? Who are you behind all of this? Like
I mean, that's a big question.
I know, it's so huge.
Massive
I
question.
can't help it.
I guess like I am a reader, like fundamentally, like at my heart I am just a reader. And I was talking to Bing before we started about how actually being in front of the camera does feel very odd to me, because you know I feel much more comfortable behind it, you know, in the same way as like I'm not necessarily a writer, but I am a real reader, like. And I think because for me in my life reading has always been a real pleasure, but also like a real space of learning, and I like that. I like to learn, and it's very, you know, you don't I don't know, I don't know that I buy into the idea of like, you know, like books are a space outside of like, you know, schools or university and places like that where you can just sit down and read and learn something. So I think fundamentally at my heart I'm like a reader and a learner. So I try and I guess approach literature in that way as like a means of connection. That's how I would see it. Like, you know, any sort of literary event is a group of people who all have read something or are interested in something, being in a room together, having a conversation about it. And like, it doesn't really get much better than that, I don't think. And I think, you know, books they're so good for that. They're so good for just starting a conversation with someone. Like, you know, one of my favorite things is just hearing what anyone else is reading, because I am genuinely very interested in like what other people like and what everyone else is reading, especially if it's different to the stuff that I'm reading. But I think what they also do is they are a bit of a gateway into having conversations that don't necessarily come about, particularly for, you know, British people. You know, we're very reserved as a nation, of, you know, for the most part. And you know, one of the events we did last year actually for the festival was an event with Durham Book Festival, with Layla Saad, who wrote Me and White Supremacy.
Yep.
And I interviewed her for the event, because I'd read her book at the start of last year, and then obviously with everything that happened across the summer with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, it was really a book that felt very of that moment and in that moment. And a lot of the stuff she talks about in that book, like, you know, about, you know, thinking about white supremacy and all the different aspects of that and the way that we've internalized it, those are big things and those are difficult things that it's, you know, it's not easy to start a conversation like that. And I think doing, you know, any sort of event that brings an author like that into a Zoom room, or, you know, an actual real room, is just a really good opportunity to have a conversation, to start a conversation like that comes from a good place. Because, you know, if you've opted in to go into an event like that or watching something like that, you're opting in because you're interested and you want to learn and you want to have that conversation. So I think they are really good springboards for conversations that we don't always have that in real life without books.
Yeah, absolutely. And like it being a space where a space that isn't necessarily like it's not a space that's going to be in like lots of conflict as well. There's going to be space for like people to be at events like that where we're touching like on things like race and not just like race, but like white supremacy, and then that tying into like so many other parts of like oppressive systems as well. It's not always just it's never as simple as we're just talking white supremacy, we're just talking race. Like there's all the stuff in between and the roots of the trees that are like so like rooted in the soil. And I think for me, what I've realized the most, I would say, is that throughout the kind of like Black Lives Matter, like kind of coming back to the forefront of like mainstream like media and stuff, I think a lot of people maybe like needed this space to really understand the historical reasons around this. And actually sometimes, as we know, like the internet can sometimes be like a really hard place, right, to sometimes ask for like a space to understand or whatever. Whereas like when you have like a book that's linked to that, you can almost like read, listen or whatever, but digest that for yourself and then go to an event where, you know, you're going to hear maybe some different things, but you've had time to kind of ruminate on some of that. And I think books do that really well. And like for me, and I said this in a talk that I did like 2 weeks ago, I was talking about it being like quite difficult to read lots of like anti-racism books, like because I have a few, but not because I don't understand racism, but just because I'm like, I want the facts, I want the figures, I want the statistics. But actually some of the best conversations I've had, it hasn't been those stats and statistics. It's just been like, it was really great that I read this book because I connected with this thing. And what did you think? Did you understand that? Like, what's your experience? And I think when we're like collectively, like, let's say speaking about race, because there's so much like variety and difference, right? And then like cultural differences on top of that. I think there has to be kind of a space to like ask questions and that be like kind of understood, like where that's coming from. And I think books really like just give you that like place already, which is really like really beautiful. So yeah, what a big question. I feel like that was like
I think you're right, because it's both. It's a way in, isn't it? It's a way into understanding and doing some of that, you know, work and research, that, you know, so you're not always, particularly if you're not of that you know, the marginalized identity, that, you know, if you don't identify with that marginalized identity, it can be, you know, we heard a lot last year about not always asking Black people to explain racism to you. And I think, you know, that is very, very right and on point. And I think books are there are already all of these resources. Like there's no real excuse for that, because there are just a plethora of like really great and really accessible books. I think that's the other thing as well. Like so many of them are so accessible.
And they give like a real history. I think that's always what gets me. It's the like the history that's given, and then like how that like is connecting with like probably why you're going to buy this book, right? And it's really important. I think that like people do also feel that like the resources are truly there, and that those resources are from people that really understand their own experience, that are literally sharing that. Which is, yeah, it's interesting. And I think, you know, there was like obviously a massive surge in like books around anti-racism and things like that, and I almost like hope that the surge is like the thing that, even if it's not like people understanding like fully wholeheartedly, but just like that surge of like some kind of like, oh, I can actually just go out and do this thing and like read this thing and learn this thing. I hope that like carries on and serves us into after the pandemic, when we're in the new reality, like whatever that is, the like cauldron, like part of whatever. So I have kind of another question about the festival. So I know that you'd been going to the festival, like, you know, before you were like a director, and you're just like living life, enjoying the festival itself. What kind of ideas and themes do you think you've like brought into the festival, like, and do those like match up with like what the conversations are that are happening within the literature community? Like, do they or don't they match up, I guess?
Yeah, so I have been a long time attendee of the Birmingham Literature Festival. Actually, I looked, like, I'm terrible at social media. I'm not a fan of it at all. But I looked on my Instagram, and one of the first photos that I'd posted on Instagram in like 2016 when I caught up with the rest of the world and actually got on Instagram, was a picture from the festival, and it was an event with Kit Deval and Jackie Kay, and that was in the rep. So I've been going to the festival for years and sort of periodically just keeping an eye out to see what jobs were coming up with Right in West Midlands and things like that. And a couple of years ago, 2019, I think they did this really, really cool panel event that was about toxic masculinity, actually. And they had a panel of authors from, I think there was a poet and like an academic and somebody who'd written a sort of journalist type book about toxic masculinity, and it was such an interesting event, and it had like a really diverse crowd, and there was a lot of really good things, a lot of really interesting things said. So I think, like, for me, like as a festival attendee, like the Birmingham Literature Festival has always been, like, I feel like has always been a good space for using books to have these like big conversations, right? And as a place to discover writers I wouldn't ordinarily have known about. So I am just really keen to sort of keep that tradition alive, and to keep using, keep using the festival as like a space to have, big important conversations, to highlight authors that maybe you're not, necessarily going to walk into Tesco and find on the shelves in Tesco. And a lot of the stuff, there's loads of great writers in the city, there's loads of great writers in the Midlands, and to sort of use the festival as a space to showcase that, because I think it's a bit of both. It's a bit of an opportunity to bring, international world-class writers like to Birmingham and really, show that, literature happens outside of London. Like, London's not the only place where cool things are, cool art things are happening. But also to show the rest of the world that, look, actually we have all of these great writers and all of these great things happening in Birmingham. Here, take a look, sort of thing. And like, being digital last year was really great for that, was really great for being able to show, like, the whole world really that this is what we do in Birmingham, this is what it's like. So yeah, I'm not sure that answers your question because I've forgotten what it was.
And then I'm just totally in what you're saying, and I'm like, oh my gosh, wow. Well, the question was about kind of what were your ideas and like themes, and like, do they basically reflect what's like happening in like the rest of the kind of literature community? But I feel like you did kind of pick up on that because you've already experienced the festival for like so many years, and then like knowing that like it's been a space to explore, to like have those kind of like harder hitting, I don't know if hard hitting is the right term, but like those types of conversations, like maybe they were difficult, but like here we are using these things here to start those conversations. Do you think there's like, in the wider community, because you mentioned earlier about kind of there being lots of obviously different festivals and trying to not necessarily differentiate yourself, but like, there's a certain kind of offer. Do you think that in seeing what other people are kind of offering, that Birmingham Literature Festival is like filling some of those, like, not gaps, but I just guess like some spaces? Do you feel that that's a thing that's happening?
I like to think so. I think it has, it never necessarily, I don't think we always, we don't necessarily deliver events in the same way. So we do a lot of like panel events, rather than sort of lots of, single author conversation type events, which is different. I think we approach things differently as well, I think, because the festival's a project of Right in West Midlands, which I probably should have explained at the beginning.
Oh wait, no, it's fine. Let's go into, you can go into that a little bit now.
Okay, good.
Perfect points.
So Writing West Midlands is the literature development agency for the region. So, and as an organisation, it does lots of different things. So it works a lot with writers and on writer development. There's like, I think, over 200 like young writers workshops like we run across the year for young writers across the Midlands. And the festival, along with lots of other stuff, and the festival's sort of another project of Writing West Midlands. So we have a slightly different model to something like Hay Festival, for instance, which is a festival first and foremost, whereas the at Writing West Midlands, the festival sort of is like brings together, I guess, a lot of the different work that we're doing across the organisation. So like one of the really cool things we did last year was ordinarily we run a programme called Young Presenters, and that is where we work with like teenagers, young writers who want or are interested in pursuing a sort of literary career or an arts career. And in the past, they've presented events at the festival or they've presented their work at the festival. And obviously we couldn't do that last year. So what we did do is I worked with two of them, and we did some training on how you interview an author and how you do a podcast. And then we got them to sort of write the questions and to interview Louise O'Neill. So that's little podcast plug, episode 5 of the podcast, if anyone wants to listen to that one.
Episode 5, people, episode 5.
Episode 5. But that was it was like a really like lovely thing to do. The two young writers we worked with were just amazing and so confident. Like I just don't know that I would have gone into something like that at 16 and been like and bossed it quite as well as they did. But like it was what a great experience for them. Like I would have also loved an experience like that at 16 to get to interview like a really big author and have that put out like on a national channel. But something like that you're not necessarily going to see at another festival. But I think like tries quite well encapsulates all the different aspects of work that we do at Writing West Midlands and the way the festival ties into all of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really awesome. Gosh, like the millennials, man, their confidence, like in terms of that, like they are feeling their oats. There's no doubt about it, and I like have so much respect for that.
Honestly, I've never felt so old and in my life, because I was like, I'll be here, like if you've got any questions, don't worry, just stop. And they just went, and I was like, I'm surplus to requirements, just fully surplus to requirements here.
They were literally just like, Shantel, we got this, it's cool,
yeah.
my thing,
You want to go and have a cup of tea? Sit down.
Enjoy, it's fine.
Yeah. So
no,
cool.
I love that, especially like getting young like writers into the spaces where they can actually like explore. I was speaking about this yesterday and how like younger generations obviously are experiencing like the internet so differently, like social media so differently, and just like their day-to-day things, right? Like they're literally growing up with like ads being like so normalized and like and I've been thinking about this quite a lot about, so like let's say part of my artistic practice isn't shared with like the world, right? Like it's just the things that I'm doing, and I think creating more space where like younger peeps can get into that like frame of mind as well, that like this is all like exploration and like testing and playing things out, like things don't have to be like perfect, they're just like go do your thing, like feel your oats, like this is, and that's what it's really kind of about. So that's just like such a cool story, like even that crossover. And I think now even for me, my own head, I'm like I understand how the two kind of connect now, and like how the festival is almost like the wider capsule for the things that are always like kind of happening, which is really awesome. I feel like especially across like the region as well, there's so many things that we have to kind of build into what we're doing like all year round as well for things like, so when like the festival comes around, it's like, oh yeah, there's like stuff, right, that's just been happening, and this is like the moment to like platform and like test and try these things out. I think it's really beautiful.
Yeah, and I think you're like so right about that. It's my colleague Emma actually who works on all the stuff that we do with young writers and young people, and she did this really organized this really cool thing in March, which was the Teen Writers Conference. And so it was a day, it was afternoon of events. And I was thinking about it this week, actually, after having read that Rethinking Diversity report, because a lot of what that report says as well is that it's about publishing and literature as an industry is like mysterious, right? None of us, we've got this idea of what happens if you're this genius writer and you sit in your room and you write a book and someone comes along and says it's amazing and it's Harry Potter, which is obviously not quite how the industry works. And so one of the things they said in the report was that actually a lot more work needs to be put into letting people know, particularly young people, know how you get into the industry, what the industry looks like, what work's involved, what the roles are, that sort of thing. Because historically publishing has been a little bit of an old boys network, I guess. And has a whole sort of financial structure around internships and things like that, which means you can only really get into it if you can afford to support yourself. But I do think I think a lot of publishing companies are addressing that now. But the reason I'm actually doing this massive digression about this particular aspect of the report is because the conference that we did for the teen writers in March had like a series of panels that was about how you get into publishing. That was should you do you want to do a creative writing degree at university? Is that an avenue you want to take? How you can support yourself as a writer if you don't necessarily want to write books, but you want to write, you want a career in writing that looks different to that, and how you can support yourself doing it. And then there was a sort of talk and a Q&A with Cressida Cowell, who's obviously a very big I think she's the children's laureate. I should know that. God, I feel terrible now. And there was a talk with her at the end.
No judgment, just saying.
I'm hoping there's no one in the audience that's like, she really ought to know that. If Emma's watching, she's probably going to be saying that back to me on Monday. But I just thought, what a great thing to have that out there, because it's actually doing that work that report's identified about demystifying what is a little bit of an unclear, obscure industry in that sense.
Absolutely. And there's so much about the demystifying, that the things that need to be demystified, because it's actually, I think, the little that I know around publishing, that I'm learning throughout this series. Shout out Nikki B for curating and producing this, because it's a big learning space for me. But I think there's so many stories in the world, right, that need to and should be explored and shared. And I think even with that, I think the publishing industry, is such a different part of that. Because it's business that's tied into that. It's almost like we have to demystify the fact that there are stories that are kind of chosen throughout the industry, because that's the one that unfortunately we live in a capitalist society, so they're the stories that then become at the forefront. And this demystifying, I think, really allows people to understand, I think, their own dreams, and to understand what it really means for them, and what the journey could look like, and knowing that it's not linear, but it's definitely possible, right? And the talk that I did with Samantha Williams and Simone Mendez, Simone kind of spoke about the sharing of the stories, and what that means when it's self-published, and what does that mean, right? There's so many different kind of areas, and I think the demystifying from at the start of your kind of career or your exploration to your career, and that's like totally regardless of age, like whenever that happens for you, I think it really like allows people to choose the path that makes sense for them as well, and not just like, oh, you have to do this or you have to do it that way. And there's so many like writers that are self-publishing, and even that in itself like is I think a form of like taking ownership or taking understanding ship. It's my own little word that needs to go in the dictionary. Of what they're, you know, of who they are and how they want their story to be handled and like managed. And it's really beautiful. I'm always here for demystifying because life is like layered, man. It's hard. Nothing's so easy.
And that's the thing, you can't, like, if you don't know that those options are available to you, well then you never apply because you never know that those options are available to you.
Exactly. And then you also like, if you did apply, then you're like, oh, what's this about? I thought this was something else, or you know, and I think it also like starts to knock down some of these walls around like gatekeeping and all of that as well, because then you start to really understand like what it means like in society as well, and like how I think it makes you value your own story even more, I think, because you know, you're like, oh, this is me, but probably so many other people's like experience, and why not kind of run with that and like not be scared, I think, to explore it within that kind of value.
Yeah, well that's like, it gives you confidence, I think, because that, you know, we grow up and what you see is that those are the stories that you think should hold space in the world, and then you get older and you realize, oh, actually there's all these different experiences.
Yeah.
Why aren't I reading about those? And I think, oh, sorry, it's a very loud car there. I think I do feel a lot of hope for, which is probably unfair, right, to put this much hope and optimism on the younger generation coming
Come
through.
on, let's hear it.
But I feel, you know, I do feel a lot of hope that they are much more confident and much more that they recognize that more so than I felt like I did growing up, that their story is worth, you know, that space is, you know, deserves to be told in as much as the next person's does.
Oh my gosh, 100%. And I think like obviously I mentioned earlier about like young people growing up in the age of the internet being very different, and even that like knowing, because you actually like can see, and like you're more likely to be able to actually tell how many stories there are like in the world because of how much access we have now. But to even know within all of that your story is still important, and I have to just really like, not that I wear hats that much, but I do have to like tip my hats to like the people that are stepping into like their truth, again, like regardless of age, but just stepping into that, and like honing in on holding different spaces for each other and for themselves. And I'm like, oh gosh, I have so much respect for that. I have so much respect.
And a good thing about the internet, right, is at least a good thing about our increasingly connected, very visible.
Yeah, exactly. And like see people's stories and see like, just see what it means, right? Like if you see someone, like you've seen someone put out like a film that they've been making, or they've been doing these little things for years, and then you see them put out something that like gets like a little kind of like award, you are seeing someone's journey, and you know it doesn't have to be the same for you, but it's still like, you know, affirming in like lots of ways. Yeah, so I have another little question. I say little, it's not little, Shantel, obviously.
None of them have been little, Zaz.
I know.
You're lying to me.
Okay, so this one is, if you could partner up with anyone, or like an organization or a group or like etc., in the whole world, to add this like little extra cherry on top of the festival and the work that you do, who would they be and why?
I mean, I'm assuming Beyonce is a given, right?
I mean, look.
if she's watching,
Me.
email me. We'll have a chat. I don't know that I have a precise answer for that. I think what was really good about last year is that we worked with, the festival's always had, sponsors. And I can see that Bing says a Beyonce Literature Festival, and I am here for that.
Exactly.
Right, 2022, that's where it's at. But I think the festival's always had partners and worked with different organizations across the city, and we did a lot of that last year as well. So for the first time we did some events in partnership with Durham Book Festival. And we co-delivered and co-promoted events with various universities and other festivals and organizations in the city. And before the pandemic properly hit, I was having conversations with different organizations across the city about partnering on venues and partnering on co-delivering events and co-promoting events. So I don't think I have a precise answer in terms of an organization, but I do think that working collaboratively is a really good thing, and I think it gets lost sometimes. I think we get very focused on doing our own thing, or I guess writing books is a good example, right? We're very used to a single person author. We're not used to things being co-written, but I do actually think there's a lot of potential and a lot of really good things in collaborating with other people and other organizations. So I guess a bit of a vague answer, but I would just keen to keep doing that, because there are, and in terms of broadening access and in terms of reaching new audiences that you might not be reaching, I think working with local organizations that are embedded in communities or in different parts of the city or different regions entirely is just the perfect route into connecting with new people and connecting with new audiences and broadening access to what we're doing. So yeah, I don't have aside from Beyonce, which is a definite yes if she is listening, or if anyone out there is connected to Beyonce. I can only assume she's watching us right now.
Obviously, from YouTube as well. Wow, she stream link and literally came through. It's crazy. I don't think that was a vague answer, by the way. I think it's a great answer, because that's the thing. The scope of everything is so big that it's it being led by allowing more people to be involved. That's a beautiful extra cherry on top, right? Because it's just what else can we do, and then not necessarily being any kind of there's the scope is so wide. Basically, it doesn't stop and say this is as far as we can go. It's kind of we could go some more. Oh, you want to get involved with us, and we could do this thing digitally, and you're in New York, great, amazing. And I love that, because it means that that having that kind of energy, it means that the festival will always be flexible and fluid in some ways, and ever changing. And I mean, in our ever-changing society, what more do you want, right? You want to kind of be able to go with that, and kind of we have so many events that just happen in a year, and I mean social kind of things that we just couldn't plan, COVID. Who knew, right? All these things that happen, and how do we stay kind of really connected to our communities and connected to people to make sure that there's always space for people. So I thought that was a beautiful answer. I really appreciate that. And obviously Beyonce,
hit me up.
We got you. We waiting. Okay, so let's have a look at the time. Oh my gosh, it's going so fast. Okay, so I've got a question, and then I've got more questions for you. Ooh. Okay, so this is from Bing. Oh, Bing's written this so nicely. if there's time for any questions. Shantel, you mentioned going to your local library growing up, that neighbourhood life and books being available to us near to where we live, to read, to borrow, pass on. And I'd love to hear what your dreams are for the libraries in Birmingham. Oh, good question, Bing. Shantel, over to you.
Great question. Money to survive would be nice. But yeah, like, you know, Erdington Library. So I still live really close to Erdington Library. And that was the big treat on a Saturday. Like, if I'd been good in the week, we could go to the library and we could take some books out. So they have a very like special place in my heart, and I lived them when I was a kid. But I don't use it that much anymore, mainly because it's really small. The opening hours are restricted now, much more so than when I was younger. So you know, and I think that's probably indicative of, you know, local branch libraries across Birmingham, I would imagine. I don't know that for a fact. But yeah, so, you know, investment obviously is key, I think. And I would have, you know, I think my friend, well, the only example I've got is my friend Adam. He lives in London, and his local library has like a graphic novel section, and it has like, yeah, which is really cool, right? And so I guess an expansion of the books that are on offer would also be very nice. I mean, I haven't been in my local library obviously for the past year because it's been shut because of the pandemic. So again, I can't speak to that being the case, but it is very small. And, you know, because it is very small, the breadth of reading and the breadth of books that are on offer isn't necessarily massive. So a sort of broadening of that in terms of inclusivity of type of book, of type of author, of, you know, the type of story that you get to read from your local library. I would love to see that just keep sort of expanding. Mostly I'd like to it'd be nice to pop back in. I don't actually know in terms of pandemic guidelines if libraries are back open now. Are they?
I don't think they I know some libraries have been open in the sense that like you kind of like have to book to like go and like get your book and then like obviously drop it back at a certain time and things like that. But actually local libraries, so where kind of Civic Square Teens, where we are kind of are and where we're working in Lazywood, you know, the local library there has like, you know, it's the funds aren't necessarily there, which means that it's only open a certain amount of times because it can only afford staffing to be open at a certain time. And so yes, you mentioning kind of like the money and the funding, I think it's like unreal how much like libraries are like local libraries mean to people, and then them not having that like real financial support, because also libraries are like a place where, you know, people just like go and sit down, right, and like go on the computers, and they've always kind of been that type of space. So I think there's like needs to be space for them to grow, and I like fully like agree. And like everything you've said, I'm like, oh, it's like there in my heart, right? Because yeah, there's something about like what that space actually means as well, and how it kind of gives people like little nooks to just go and sit in and like read a book or like look through a thing. Even this like the thought of like there being like a graphic novels in somewhere, I'm like, yo, let's give people the money, give the people what they want, you know, like let's do that. And I definitely share those like hopes and dreams for local libraries, because I just think they're like, I feel like a lot of people I speak to, they're always like the library has this real connection to like your childhood, and that's kind of really beautiful. So I share those hopes and dreams. Thank you, Bing, for that question. That was really great.
Yeah, it was a great question.
It was a good one. Okay, so I'm gonna go into in the list of questions that I wrote, this bit was like the extra bits, so like that was like under that headline. So this is more to do with like kind of your personal connection with like the work that you do, the work that you're like doing. So what like artists, writers, or people from the past do you like most resonate with like now, and why?
It's a good question. I mean, writers, I could give you a very, very long list. So if everyone's
I thought you were going to say that.
if everyone's happy to sit here for the next 2 to 3 hours, I'll start running through them in alphabetical order. I gotta say, writers wise, someone who has been massive to me is Sadie Smith. I'm a huge Sadie Smith fan, like a lot of other people in the world. But I would say I say Sadie Smith because she was the first. Reading White Teeth when I was a teenager was the first time I'd read a book. And there's this great scene in White Teeth where Irie, who is a teenager, who is a mixed race teenager, goes into a salon. She goes into a black hair salon, and she just doesn't know. She doesn't know what's happening. She turns up on time, and then everyone in the salon's like, why have you turned up on time? No one turns up on time. She doesn't know, she's not supposed to have washed her hair before she has her hair relaxed. And I had my hair relaxed for the first time when I was 11. And it wasn't until like I'd read White Teeth that I ever felt like I'd opened a book and I'd seen myself, which is, it's the cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason, right? Because that's important. It's important to open a book every now and again and see what feels like a reflection of your life. So White Teeth was that for me. And I wrote about White Teeth for my MA thesis. I wrote 2 chapters on Sadie Smith books for my PhD thesis. So again, if Sadie Smith's watching, hit me up. We'll talk about a festival event.
Let's go. Come on.
Sadie, Beyonce, what a panel.
Yeah.
What a panel.
Oh my gosh, we're planning the festival next year. Look at this, man. This is the beautiful collaboration that we live for.
White Teeth, feels like very special to me. I've got like a real connection. And it's sort of traveled across, like, from reading it when I was a teenager to spending far too long of my adult life writing about it, I think. I think so Sadie Smith's been very important. Who else? I guess she's probably the best example. Oh my god, have you just got a snack delivered?
I just got tea delivered. It's actually a coffee. Man, this is just the life. It's the weekend and I'm like living this conversation, this being delivered. I can't anyway.
But yeah, I think she's probably the best example of like a writer that has really, really always resonated. And I feel like every book she writes is different to the one that she's written before. And like she's a writer that you can really look at, as I did in my PhD thesis, but like, look at something like White Teeth and then look at something like Swing Time and see a reflection of that character, but very, very different. Like there's a real growth in that, which I don't think, not all writers have cracked that.
Yeah, I really love the fact that like you just open this book and you're just like, oh, what is it? Oh my god, what? Okay, wow. Like I love that. I was like, just even that moment, I'm not sure if I've like had that particular moment yet for myself. However, I would say Yersa Daily Ward, like I remember reading The Terrible in like one like sitting. I was sucked in, I was there, I was like, and what I thought was like so beautiful about it was like how sometimes I think about things is how she lays out the words in like poetry form, and that's like how my brain works. That was my direct connection. So I can only imagine if like if her work when I was 16 would have been appropriate for me to read, I would have been like, oh, that's that. Oh my gosh, right? So this is me, my MA, my PhD. This is what I'm talking about, this book. So I love that. I haven't actually read any of Zadie's work, but I like will. And I'm really into reading like YA books or like books that are like not necessarily like for me, but I'm like interested in it and I read Pet by Akwaeke, and that was really awesome. Even though I kind of like knew what was going on, what was happening, I hadn't read a book that had like a trans character at the center, but like their transness isn't the center of the story at all. They're just like this badass, like slaying monsters and like doing all this like really great stuff, which is quite beautiful. Yeah, that was like a moment. I think these are like my moments.
It's powerful, right? It is powerful, like seeing that, being able to open a book and see something like that is very, and for it to not be the center of the story, I think is where we're moving to now, which is also amazing.
It's beautiful. It's just like, oh, I can enjoy this and like feel this thing, but not be like, oh, this is your whole like identity in this one like part here. So my next kind of little question, which is probably going to round off this conversation. So is there kind of just anything that like influences you like quite positively, like about like your work, like what like moves you? That obviously doesn't have to be a book, it could be like anything, but what is it that's like your like heart's like joy, I guess? And just like to continue to want to create these spaces for these stories and for these experiences.
I think that's what's great about, if you do any sort of literature event or anything like that, is once it's happening and you can like feel the vibes in the room, and or you talk to people after something's happened and the feedback's good, like it just always feels worth it, I think. Like, and I think, going back to the story about my dad listening to the podcast, I don't really have a better way of putting it other than that like knowing that we'd put that out in the world and that has like, resulted in my dad now reading a book, and a book that he might not have read before. He started reading fiction, and or when he first started his reading journey, it was all very non-fiction based. I don't know that there's a sort of better way of putting it than, knowing that you've created a moment of connection for somebody else, or that you've created a space for them to just, spend an hour talking about a book that they love, or, spend an hour discovering an author that they didn't know about before, or, working with those two young writers and just listening in as they just boss that interview and just being like, okay, well, they've done that now. Like, that's pretty cool for them. Yeah, do you know what I mean? Like, as that is really, I think that, or any sort of moment where you get to do something that feels like, someone else is enjoying it as well, like it's, something that's existed in your brain and you put it out in the world and other people are like, oh no, this is really cool. Like that's a pretty good moment, I think. And I really hope you're going to ask me to recommend 3 books, because Zaz, I've been thinking about this all week.
I am, don't worry, I am. Okay, like that question was not going to be lost, okay, because I know that the first time I even asked you that, you were like, how could I not ask you this today? That would be like honesty. Okay, so for the big question of on the Settee today, Shantel, could you recommend 3 books, please?
Thank you for asking me this question. I have sweating about all week on the dog walk, just like, what 3 books am I going to ask? So here we go, and I'll tell you my reasonings, my rationale, and I'll keep it to 2 minutes to keep us on time. Obviously I'm going to say White Teeth, because I think it's a joy, and that everyone should read it. Now, this is my category of favourite book I've read so far in 2021. And I am going to say for that, A Little Devil in America by Hanif Abdurraqib, I think is how you say his name. And it's all about like a part cultural study, part memoir, of Black performance in America, which is very cool and like poetic and just a great read. And then I've gone with childhood fave, which this is a cliche but is also true, and I've got to say Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, which is just, everyone's, I think most people's childhood favorite.
It's a full-on classic
for a reason, right? So those are my three, and I just had to shoehorn that in there because I just thought I can't have sweated about this all week and then Zaz not actually ask me about it.
No, I was gonna get there. Don't worry. I'll just like keep on your toes, man. I knew I was like, oh, you think it's gonna go down. No, this has been amazing, Chantal. Thank you so much. I'm like, and I literally say this every week, every like after every single like conversation that I have, like I'm like just properly like full of like gratitude and just like everything that like could be great on a Saturday is like happens basically for me like after like every talk, and I just really like I've appreciated just talking to you, and it's been like so awesome. I'm just like thank you, like because you just bought yourself, and that's what I always want. I always want that for these talks, and it's been like really great, and I hope that it's been great for you as well.
Yes, I've had a wonderful time. Thank you so much for having me and for all the really good, tough questions.
I can't help it, man. These questions, they just be like they're here, and like I'm glad that like everyone just still rolls with me after this. That they still like think that I'm like a nice human being after these like heavy layered questions. But yeah, Chantal, thank you like so much for just being here and bringing your energy today. I've like appreciated it so much. And yeah, feel free to say your buys, and then I'll talk a little bit about the next on the settee and what that is going to look like.
Yep, thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for the lovely questions. And thanks everyone for watching.
That's all right. Thank you so much. Make sure you just, everyone stays in the realm of with us, and like remembers that you can also just like catch up with this whenever, because we are streaming to a YouTube. So I'm just going to speak about the next on the settee, and I'm just going to put on a little holding screen and just chat to you about where we kind of are going. So I will be speaking to Sophia on the 15th of May. So Sophia is a 22-year-old recent publishing graduate and book reviewer who reviews books kind of online as well for about like 7 years, and has been really dedicated to promoting diverse literature. And as part of her final university dissertation, Sophia focused on diversity within children's and YA fiction. So I will basically be talking to Sophia a lot about what kind of YA books are, what that means, I guess, for her, and what it means to also review that. And I'm pretty excited because I feel like Sophia is very much like a force to be reckoned with, I should say. And yeah, hopefully you all kind of meet me back here in 2 weeks' time. And this is Sophia's face here as well. So yeah, thank you all for watching and listening. Thanks for everyone who is going to be listening in the future. Yeah, thank you all so much.